Welcome to Team Peri's Step Out of Line podcast, featuring co-hosts Peri and Lori Finkelstein. Together, they explore, meet, and share inspirational stories with guests who have made a positive impact in today's world. This podcast resonates with our hope to make this world a better place one step at a time through love, acceptance, and uplifting conversations.
I have always been a little bit out of line because existing in a world that is not welcoming to me as someone with a disability has led me to find ways to go a little bit outside of the box and push what people might accept as the norm. I've never been okay with letting people settle into the notion that having a disability is a bad thing or that I am somehow wrong as a human being simply for existing. And so the way that I tend to step out of line is by not staying silent when I notice an instance of discrimination or stigma or prejudice toward the disability community and speaking up and speaking out about it and joining others in the disability community who are doing the same, because I am such a big believer in trying to move forward and to shift hearts and minds and attitudes. And so I think that I'm always just a little bit out of line, and I like it like that.
When you were a child, did you go to a mainstream school? Did you go to a school for kids with disabilities?
My parents initially looked into sending me to a school for kids with disabilities, the Henry Viscardi School on Long Island. And they ultimately decided against it, mostly because it was quite far from where we live. So it would have been about an hour each way for me on the bus. And it just didn't really seem sustainable. So they instead decided to send me to our local public school. And that in and of itself was a little bit of an adventure because the school that is closest to my house is just now about, 33 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, more fully accessible. At the time that I had gone to school, it was not yet accessible, which was definitely a problem considering that both the ADA and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was already in place. And there was no elevator. And so I wouldn't have been able to get up to the second floor. And so that was a problem. And my parents ended up sending me to another elementary school in our district that was further away from my house because that was the one that was one level and didn't require an elevator. So my education always had a bit of a fight to it.
It sounds very familiar. Perry experienced the same thing where she had to go to another school that wasn't in our zone in the district because it was on one level, the same thing. And they try as they might, it depends who she had. She had some wonderful teachers, but they didn't know what to do with her a lot.
And I was ministering in public school for most of my life until high school. In high school, I switched to Henry Art School. I was in bullying and had disability. I think it was a great experience. It also had auditions, but I think I was better off than staying where I was in public school. I don't think I would admit it if I did.
But like she said, that school, while it had a lot of advantages, had some disadvantages as well. And there was bullying in that school as well.
I've heard a lot of people who said they had really positive experiences at the Henry Viscardi School. I have a lot of friends who went there, but they also noted that they struggled a lot with feeling more segregated from mainstream community. So there were positives and negatives for sure. I've done a lot with the Viscardi Center, and I think that ultimately the work that they do is really important in providing a welcoming and safe environment for students with disabilities that may not be readily available. in a mainstream public school. Ultimately, there are ways that I benefited from going to mainstream school, and there are ways that I probably would have benefited from going to Viscardi. So it's definitely something that I think about a lot and how it shaped the path that I took.
I think having both the education that it kind of hit me for all five.
But Perry kind of felt like she was paving the way in some ways in the business school. And it wasn't all easy, as accommodating as Adelphi is. The physical boundaries were overcome, but only when she opened up her mouth and said, I can't go in this building. I can't turn my head and see the blackboard. Send me to another building, move the whole class. So constantly it was a battle, but she was able to take all of that on her own and do it, which also is good practice for the real world.
100%. And I had very similar experiences in that when I was looking around for colleges, Adelphi was definitely one of the more accessible ones, but at the same time, there were still some things that needed fixing. And so I remember after taking the first tour of the campus, there was a really big bump that I would have had to encounter each time I was rolling from my dorm because I lived on campus to, where I went to go get food every day. And so I had to ask them to turn that into a curb cut. And then there was a building for the honors college program, and I don't believe that they had ever had a student who used a mobility device before. And so I had to ask them to install buttons for me so that the doors would open automatically. And I had to ask them to give me key card access to the basement of the building because that was where part of the honors college building was, and it was ultimately also where I ended up getting a job down in the basement of one of the buildings. And so there was a constant need to advocate for specific accessibility requirements that I had, and doing a lot of that being the first, but it never being, quite perfect because there's always more to be done. The positive of that is knowing that each time someone is the first, it paves the way for somebody else.
And then you went to get your master's.
Well, I actually started a master's program in disability studies back in 2014. And then after a little while in that program, I ended up finding my way into a couple of career opportunities. And so I put the master's program on hold and pursued work. And I've not completed the master's, but I have found that that initial foundation was really what solidified my belief that I wanted to go into advocacy and education around disability as a career. So I don't have a master's, just, my bachelor's in English. And then I would say my other qualifications in regard to disability related work is really the school of life.
As a parent, when I'm taking Perry wherever we're going, young children, I feel, are more open to people with a disability or in a wheelchair. And they begin to smile at Perry and maybe like wave their little hand at her until the parent pulls them away. And I'm sure you've seen it. And it kind of breaks your heart a little bit, wondering, why does this happen? As a child, did you experience the same thing? And how did you deal with that?
This is something that I think about quite often because when you have a disability that is so apparent and visible, it's hard not to go out in public without encountering someone who is staring or has questions or is curious or makes a comment. And I wrote a little bit about this in my book, but one thing that is so important to me is finding a way to support the curiosity of kids and not make disability or a disabled person into something or someone scary. Because so often a kid is simply learning about the world around them, and the parent is the one who turns disability into a taboo by, shushing them, pulling them away, saying, watch out. It makes it feel like you are a bad person simply for existing, when the reality is that disability is a very natural part of the human experience. And so I've really taken to asking people who are in parent or caregiver roles to not shush a child and stifle that curiosity. You don't want to encourage rudeness, and you
Right.
don't want to encourage being outright nosy or invasive. But at the same time, if a child has a question, if they say, "Oh, what is that?" or, "What happened to you?" If it's a child, I'm much more willing to say, "Well, I was born with something called a disability, and it means that my legs don't work in the same way that you do. So I use a wheelchair to get around." And I also understand parents don't always love when their kids are engaging with a stranger. So the other option is for the parent to simply say, "Oh, that's a wheelchair. Just like you walk around on your legs, they use their wheelchair to get around." So keep it very simple and open and straightforward, and don't focus so much on scaring the child away from that curiosity. And if you don't know the answer to something as a parent or caregiver, don't make it up or don't shy away from it entirely. Say, "You know what? I'm not really sure. Why don't we go home and learn about it together?" I think that it's really all about being open to learning rather than teaching a child that they should be scared of disability.
You were on Sesame Street when you were 10, and here you were representing. Did you realize the weight of what you were doing on your shoulders, that you were it for everybody?
I think that being 10 years old means that a lot of the gravity and the importance of it was something that I realized in hindsight. But at the same time, what I've also come to realize is that while it meant so much to get to be the representation that people had been looking to see, I'm far from the only person who should or can be that kind of representation. I always say, if you've met one person with a disability, then you've met one person with a disability. And there is no such thing as a singular experience of having a disability. And so I never want people to think that I speak for everyone or represent everyone. And yes, it's an honor to have been representative of a particular community on the show. But at the same time, the older I get, the more I remind myself that that was an incredible privilege to have that launch pad, and not everybody has it. And I want to get to a point where it's no longer so out of the ordinary for that kind of representation to be in the media.
Do you think it's because of your experiences growing up and as a child, and that things have been different, that at one point you should say, "Screw it, I'm different. Let me just make a big splash and do what I have to do."
I don't know that I ever woke up one morning and consciously decided that this was the direction that I'm meant to take. I think it was just the entirety of my lifetime continuing to build upon itself. And initially, I thought I was going to be a high school English teacher. And I certainly was an advocate, but I didn't think that it was something that I was going to do professionally. And then I would say it actually wasn't until I got to college and I really began to realize just how many gaps in knowledge there were around disability, that things started to shift for me. And I knew that this was the direction that I wanted to take. And I think one thing in particular that really stood out to me was that there was a focus on one week drunk driving awareness. And then the following week, there was a focus on disability awareness. And I could not, in my mind, get over the juxtaposition of those two, because drunk driving is a very dangerous problem. Disability is a part of a person. And to me, there was a struggle in situating disability as something you should only be aware of, rather than something that you accept as part of what makes someone who they are. And so that was really a big turning point for me. And I remember I wrote an article for the college newspaper about that juxtaposition and just asking people to reconsider this framing of just being aware of disability, because I don't want you to be aware of my existence. I want you to be accepting of my existence. That was big for me. And then there were other moments where I felt like I was being tokenized, or I felt like disability was being inadequately talked about within broader conversations. But on the flip side of that, I had professors who were extremely supportive when I took an assignment that was completely unrelated to disability, and I would do a disability related reading or interpretation of a book or a project focused on disability. I had that support to really lean into filling those gaps through my own work. And that was what really motivated me when I realized this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I'm interested in. And I have the knowledge, I have the life experience. I now want to support others who also have this knowledge and life experience to be able to share their stories.
Peri, what she was fighting for at Adelphi at one point was to introduce the notion, just to get them thinking that they are like you and there's no difference. You should treat them like any other. And she was still, 10 years after you graduated, still trying to get students to understand that it was just a human being right next to you.
I think that any place that you are a part of, any school that you attend, anywhere that you are, is just going to be a microcosm of the larger world, where there are going to be people who aren't going to understand or accept disability. And then there are going to be people who recognize your full humanity as someone with a disability. And so I think that was definitely representative of my experience too, where I had many wonderful people that I encountered, and then some people who were a little bit uncomfortable or uncertain or unsure. For me, knowing that it was the same 10 years later is really a reminder that there is still so much work to be done and that this work is really important. Adelphi does, quite a lot of work in the areas of disability and accessibility. I definitely commend them on what they're continuing to try to do to make the campus as accessible as possible.
If you had to set goals for yourself for the next 5 years, create, let's say, a vision board, what would you put on it?
Every time I'm asked what my 5-year plan is, I always say that I'd just like to be doing what I'm doing now and continuing to grow it on a larger scale. So much of my work is focused on connecting with people and meeting them where they are in terms of learning about disability, and also really helping other people share and write and amplify their stories about disability. And so if I could continue to do that 5 years from now, that's exactly what I would still be doing, because there is nothing that I am more passionate about than being able to find ways to use how I communicate to support other people to communicate. And I know it sounds like, a cheesy, silly answer, but I really mean that from the bottom of my heart.
And maybe the pandemic made us a little kinder and sure opened up the world technology wise of what's accessible.
I think that this is a silver lining that I have heard about quite a bit. There's something known as the curb cut effect, which is essentially to say that if you have a curb going from a street to a sidewalk, not everybody can get up and down that curb. But if you have a curb cut, suddenly you've created access for everyone, whether it's a pedestrian who's walking, whether it's someone with a mobility device, a caregiver pushing a stroller, a kid on a skateboard, somebody rolling luggage. I have come to look at what the pandemic has done is create virtual curb cuts, create access for everyone in a way that had not previously existed, by welcoming people in via virtual or hybrid options. And so I think that the pandemic itself was a reminder that there is more than one way to exist in this world and more than one way to succeed. And I think that people who don't have experience with disability tend to see it as a niche issue, or don't think of it as something that they should really think about at all. And they also tend to look at it as something that's just uncomfortable and very unfamiliar to them. But really, I think that my best piece of advice for anyone is just act naturally. Be yourself as you would with anybody else. And that goes for whether you're interacting in person, whether you're interacting virtually. Be yourself, act natural, and do what you can to ensure that you're making the environment accessible and inclusive for everybody.
Do you ever personally get in a situation where you're dumbfounded and all of a sudden you feel like you're 9 years old again and your voice just doesn't come through because of the situation? Because I know Peri felt like that at a doctor appointment where I've never seen her dumbfounded before, where she had no response for a discriminatory conversation that she had with office personnel. Do you ever just walk away and say, "Oh, I should have said this, I should have said that," or you know how to answer everything?
I don't think that I will ever have all the answers. I think that I will forever be the type of person who comes up with my best responses at 3 o'clock in the morning or when I'm taking a shower. I think that that's just what it means to be human. We don't always know exactly what to say in the moment, we don't always get it right. And I know that so often I think of my response to someone well after I wish it would have come to me. I think that the experience of being someone who has a very apparent disability just means by that very nature that you're going to be subjected to people saying things. And while I try to, always be on my game, it's not always possible because I'm also just a human being. There have been plenty of times where I've just been kind of struck silent in the moment because I wasn't sure how to respond. And I wish that moments like that didn't happen. But I also know that it's just an indication that the path that I'm on as someone who's an advocate and an educator is necessary and important.
And I feel wish people knew.
About you
Yeah,
that no, many people
yeah.
don't know.
One thing you wouldn't know unless you met me in person is that I have a peacock feather tattoo on my wrist. And I have that because I very often joke that my wheelchair is very much like having peacock feathers. It announces me when I enter a room. And so I have come to embrace that. And peacocks are beautiful animals and my favorite animals. And so because I am so noticeable, it's something that I have just tried to embrace and celebrate about myself.
No matter how I really wondering that happened.
We were walking in the city and a lady just fell in Perry's lap at a crosswalk and was started screaming. And I finally said, "Lady, get off my kid's lap." And she was like so flustered. And she was in Perry's lap, and we were looking at her like,
And then
"What?"
that off for a minute. I shut it off.
Right. And we were hysterical. I thought we were going to make in our pants. We were laughing so much because we couldn't believe that it was happening. And we've been talking about it literally for like 5 years.
There was one time when I was in a train station and someone was entirely not watching where they were going and just fell right across my lap. They were so angry at me as though it was my fault that I was simply going about my day. But at the time it was mortifying, but you just have to laugh. And more recently, I was at a restaurant and I was at the table and my wheels were in as far as they could go, but there was a woman who was being kind of rude to the wait staff and she was demanding to sit at a different table, and as she was busy complaining to the wait staff, she wasn't paying attention and she tripped right over the back of my wheels and she fell on the floor, and she got up and she began to scream to the entire restaurant that I was a safety hazard and I didn't belong there, and they should have put traffic cones around me or something. And I was like, ma'am, I'm a human being, not a dangerous object.
See, good comeback.
In that moment, I had the comeback. She did not appreciate the comeback. I got the look of death. That is something that happens, I think, all the time when you're, out and about in any kind of mobility device. In the moment, it's like, oh my goodness, but afterwards, it is amusing. I was once carried up the stairs of a subway station because the elevator was broken by the fire department. So not to scare you away from the city because I live there and I make
Right.
it work, but it's something.
The city, every time we go, we always have a wheelchair fiasco, and we're always ending up just going to like a fire station in case we need help. We'll be hanging out right by there.
Oh God, it's always something.
It's always
Always
something.
something.